I wanted to do a case study with you guys, and we're going to look at Numbers 13 and 14. And I want you to read this together, talk to the person next to you, and see if you see any kind of similarities between what we're talking about here and the Numbers story. I want you to read Numbers 13 and 14 together. There's a promise given. Okay, there's a promise given. And how well people pay attention to the promise or how well people believe the promise determines the results. Okay? I want you to read this text together and talk about it in light of the conversation we just had. So talk about this together, if you would. Optimistic versus pessimistic eschatology. Yeah. So read Numbers 13 and 14 together. Okay, what do you guys think? Yeah, they were scared. Should they have been scared? No, why not?
Because the Lord was with them.
And God had promised them the promised land. God said, it's yours. Here's the point I want to make from this. They were promised the promised land, right? That's why it's called the promised land, right? They didn't trust in the promise of God, so they didn't go get it. The giants are too big. Right? We're going to die. And I wonder if doubt of God's promises causes similar things to happen in our day. If we really believe that he must reign until all of his enemies are made a footstool for his feet, the last enemy to be destroyed is death. If we really believe that he will establish justice in the earth, if we really believe these kinds of things, which we haven't argued for yet, right? But what I'm saying is this, your eschatology determines your life. It determines how you live. And I'm not saying what James, I'm not trying to make this super non-subtle jab at people with pessimistic eschatologies that they're going to be judged. I'm not saying that. But I am saying, I do think there's something of an analogy to be made. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your inheritance, the ends of the earth your possession. And Christ did not forget to ask. But do we live like he did? And how might we engage the lost? How might we plant churches? How might we do daring things for the kingdom of God against the giants in our time if we truly believed the promise of God and acted on it? Okay, let's talk about eschatology in the early church. Let's talk about the importance of church history in studying eschatology, okay? Why would it be important to study church history when we talk about eschatology? Yeah, because we're not the only believers. Because God has given to his church pastors and teachers to build up the body of Christ, and they don't all exist in our time, right? They existed long before us, and they will exist long after we're gone. Good. So I'll give you guys a few reasons. One, in the fathers, we know that many of them knew apostles or were even discipled by apostles directly, right? We know that many of them knew apostles or were even discipled by apostles directly. And there are many false assumptions about the development of eschatology in the church, especially the early church. There's many false assumptions about eschatology in the early church. Now, there's a danger of anachronism. That's a big word, right? Do you guys know what anachronism means? So there's kind of like a popular version and an academic version. So this is the popular version. You see a movie, like we were talking about Gladiator earlier. Let's say that you're watching Gladiator. I'm Maximus Decimus Radius, father to a murdered son, husband to a murdered wife, and I will have my vengeance in this life or the next. And he has that sword in his hand, right? He throws it on the ground. And then someone in the crowd takes out a sniper rifle and shoots Maximus Decimus Meridius in the head. That can't happen. Why can't that happen? Because because guns weren't invented yet. Right? We would look at that and we would say, you can't have guns in this movie. That's not fair. That's anachronistic. You're taking something from the future and bringing it into the past. Okay? That happens sometimes with movies, historical movies. Academically, it's taking categories that haven't been named yet and forcing them onto people in the past. So what this looks like is this. Athanasius was a Calvinist. There you go. Athanasius was a Calvinist. Well, yeah. Like we look and we say, this person is a dispensationalist. This person is a premillennialist. This person is a, you fill in the gaps, right? You can't do that. You can't do that if you can't go to them and say, do you hold to progressive dispensationalism? And if they would look at you like, nah, right? Then you can't give them that label. That's what anachronism is, right? And anachronism just simply abounds. It just simply abounds, especially when it comes to the church fathers. It's a shame. It's a shame. This is a claim. Okay, claim. The early church was dispensational, premillennial. Have you ever heard that before? At least the early church was premillennial. Oh yeah. In fact, Greg Allison, Historical Theology, page 658, the early church looked forward to its reward, the rapture, for its perseverance through tribulation. That's a claim not just of premillennialism, but dispensational premillennialism. Charles Ryrie said this: premillennialism is the historic faith of the church. I've heard that many times. I'm sure you have too. Claim number 2, before Origen's allegorical method, everyone was premillennial, and then Origen came in and just mucked the whole thing up by introducing allegory, and now we have allegorical interpretations of Revelation 20, and no one's premillennial anymore thanks to Origen. So again, the prevailing opinion that Christ was to come and reign 1,000 years among men before the final dissolution of the world had met with no opposition previous to the time of Origen. Greg Allison once again. Origen particularly criticized the literal interpretation of Scripture upon which premillennialism was based. Did you see that? Now what's very interesting here is what was the foundation of the early church's premillennialism, according to Greg Allison here? Literal interpretation. Literal interpretation was the foundation of premillennialism. Origen comes in, disrupts all of that, and now we no longer have an appreciation for literal interpretation. Next, claim number 3. Augustine of Hippo invented amillennialism. Augustine of Hippo invented amillennialism. So, again, Augustine established the amillennial understanding of Revelation 20. By the 5th century, premillennialism had given way to another eschatological framework known as amillennialism. Now, what is true is this. In the city of God, we have an extensive, detailed exegesis of Revelation 20 from a perspective that says Satan has been bound. Right? All these events are currently happening. The first resurrection has already happened, all of that. Here's a more balanced approach, okay? Here's a more balanced approach. Number 1, the early fathers had a simple, underdeveloped eschatology. They had a very simple, underdeveloped eschatology. Number 2, the early church had a variety of opinions about the return of Christ. Not one. They had a variety of opinions. And many of the church fathers who believed that Christ would reign on earth for 1,000 years received that belief from Genesis 1 and not Revelation 20. Did you know that? Even before Origen. We'll get there. And lastly, none of the creeds of the early church designated a 1,000-year reign of Christ. Rather, they placed the return of Christ and the resurrection from the dead as happening at the same time. All of the early church creeds. Now, that doesn't mean that they're writing against premillennialism, but it does mean that views besides premillennialism find their home more neatly in those creeds and confessions. Gary Nemar has a book called The Early Church and the End of the World, and that book was incredibly helpful in directing me towards sources for this next section. But let's look first at the Apostles' Creed, okay? Let's look at the Apostles' Creed. Read this and talk about this in your group. When it comes to views of eschatology, what does it say about eschatology, and what does it not say about eschatology? So this is early, around the 200s, around the year 200 or so. What does it say? What claims does it make? What eschatological claims does it make? What eschatological claims does it not make? Okay, let's start with what does it not say? It's very general. Yeah, it's very general. Isn't it? Yeah, there's no mention of Revelation 20 at all, actually. The Antichrist isn't mentioned. The rise of the Antichrist is not mentioned. Good. It does not talk about the ark and the temple. That's exactly right. So, what does it say? What claims does it make about eschatology? Yeah. Good. Yeah, the resurrection of the body. Judgment. Christ will judge. Yeah, the coming of Christ. Good. So, here's some observations here. Number one, the creed does not necessitate any millennial position. However, it most certainly is more comfortable to be affirmed by amillennialist or postmillennialist. Because it does not mention Christ coming back and reigning on earth for 1,000 years, right? Number two, it lends itself towards a more simple eschatology. It doesn't affirm belief in the reformation of the Jewish state, the reconstruction of the temple, or a personal antichrist. It doesn't talk about any of that. It doesn't affirm belief in a 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth. Rather, it affirms that when Jesus comes, he will judge the living and the dead. Do you see that? When Jesus comes, he comes to judge, not coming to earth to reign for 1,000 years first. Now, why is that important? It's important because if the church really did have a uniform understanding of eschatology, and that uniform understanding of eschatology was premillennial, meaning that Christ would come to earth and reign for 1,000 years prior to the end, wouldn't the Apostles' Creed advocate for that? Why is it so broad if it's so clear that the early church fathers believed in premillennialism? But even historic premillennialism believes that Christ will come back, establish an earthly kingdom for 1,000 years. I think it's because there was not a major consensus in the church. And I think it's because the church's eschatology was very underdeveloped. They were still growing in their understandings of eschatology. Let's look at some of the ante-Nicene fathers. First Clement of Rome. There's going to be a lot here. I want you to, you can ask questions if you want to. Let this flow over you. I think I have 9 examples. And the reason I've given 9 examples is I want the cumulative effect of this to be felt. That there's far more to be said here than simply the early church was premillennial. The early church was waiting for the rapture. So Clement said this in 1 Clement, "We do then deem it any great and wonderful thing for the maker of all things to raise up again those who have had piously served him in the assurance of a good faith, when even by a bird he shows us the mightiness of his power to fulfill his promise. For the Scripture saith in a certain place, Thou shalt raise me up, and I shall confess unto thee. And again, I lay me down and slept, and I awake, because thou art with me. And again, Job says, Thou shalt raise up the flesh of mine, which has suffered all these things." 1 Clement 23. "Of truth, soon and suddenly shall his will be accomplished. As the Scriptures also bear witness, saying, Speedily he will come and not tarry, and the Lord shall surely come to his temple, even the Holy One for whom we look." Describing the second coming, right? But do you notice he makes no mention of a millennium? That does not mean he didn't believe in a millennium, but he doesn't make mention of it. It's very similar to the Apostles' Creed, where he believes that when Christ comes back, there's going to be a resurrection. The hope is then in the resurrection and not in a rapture. And he doesn't mention Christ's reign on earth. Again, it doesn't mean he wasn't persuaded of what we call today premillennialism, but he certainly doesn't make it clear that that's what he believes. The grandsons of Jude before Domitian. Can someone read this for us? Okay. Do you see the same thing here? What are your observations? Yeah, Christ will come. He'll judge the living and the dead.
That's my position.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Which is, everyone agrees with that, right? Everyone agrees with that. But again, if the early church had a consensus around what we would call today a premillennial view, why do they not make mention of it here? Why instead are they looking to the second coming of Christ, which again finds its home far more easily in an amillennial or postmillennial view? The expectation is not that Jesus would return and set up an earthly kingdom for 1,000 years. Instead, the grandsons of Jude understand Christ's kingdom to be a heavenly kingdom, right? Not an earthly kingdom. And it will come to earth when Jesus returns. Next, the epistle of Barnabas. Can someone read this excerpt from book 1, paragraph 146? Okay. So this is a couple hundred years before Origen. And the epistle of Barnabas is arguing for a 1,000-year reign of Christ from what text? Genesis 1. In fact, most of the early church fathers found, when they did find premillennialism, they found it from Genesis 1 and not from Revelation 20. And Peter? Peter and Genesis 1, okay? So it doesn't fit within a view that says that all the church fathers interpreted literally until Origen came. And when Origen came, that's when they stopped interpreting literally, and then amillennialism came out of that, right? It doesn't fit the narrative that literalism prevailed until the bad guys of Origen and Augustine came to be. Let's consider next Irenaeus. So a postmillennialist actually also could claim the Epistle of Barnabas too, then, right? A Puritan postmillennialist, like a classic postmill guy that you find in this book, would hold to the position that there is a 1,000-year golden age on the earth. And they could just as readily affirm everything that is written there. Irenaeus. Who can read this? Okay. And one more quote from Against Heresies. So what do we see here? We certainly see something that would be more comfortable in a futurist interpretation, right? And probably, he mentions a reconstructed temple in Jerusalem as well, which is very interesting. Where does he get his premillennialism from, though? Genesis 1. He talks about the seventh day coming in, not from Revelation 20. So while he certainly would be at home among many premillennialists and dispensationalists in his views of Israel, he's not getting it from the text that they're claiming they got it from. Does that make sense? Justin Martyr. Let's look at his dialogue with Trypho. Who can read this? So do you see that he affirms something that premillennialists would be very comfortable with. But then he says there are a few. No, he says there are many Christians who disagree. And he differentiates those Christians who disagree with heretics that teach other doctrines. So he has categories for Christians who hold to different eschatological views, and then there's the guys who are way out there, right? Again, this does not fit a narrative that the entire world was premillennial, and then Origen and Augustine ruined everything. One more quote from Dialogue with Trypho. So while he does affirm in the first quote a future for Israel, he does not differentiate that from a future for Gentiles in this section, right? Let's talk then about the shepherd of Hermas. Let's read from Vision 3, chapter 8. Who can read this? So in the vision, what has to come before the end? Yeah, with the tower which represents the church. You'll read this in Vision 3. The church must be established first. Okay? But what he doesn't look for is, again, a reign of Christ on earth for 1,000 years. He makes no mention of that. Look at the fourth vision, chapters 2 and 3. Who can read this? So what's the eschatology here? Yeah, who's in the tribulation? There's a type of the tribulation that's occurring now and a beast that's now, right? But it's a type of the future tribulation. So no rapture of the church before the tribulation found here. And what's the purpose of the tribulation in here? Purifying the elect, to make them fit to become parts of the tower of the church, right? Again, it does not fit with a premillennial view, I don't think. The Epistle to Diognetus says this in 10.2. He sent his only begotten Son, to whom he promised the kingdom, which is in heaven, and will give it to those who have loved him. So the kingdom then, not, as premillennialists would say, on earth for 1,000 years. Instead, the kingdom is a heavenly kingdom, which again fits far more in line with an amillennial view or a postmillennial view. I'm not saying the Epistle to Diognetus was amillennial or postmillennial. I'm saying it certainly doesn't fit into a premillennial view, though. Premillennialists tend to believe that the kingdom is established. Premillennialists believe that the kingdom is established at the beginning of Revelation 20 when Jesus sets up a throne in Jerusalem. They believe the kingdom is on earth, and they believe, but not the kingdom. Premillennialists don't believe the kingdom is in heaven. They believe the kingdom is on earth, and it will be in the future 1,000 years. I agree with you. I agree with everything you're saying, but it doesn't fit within premillennialism. So premillennialists would tend to put the sheep and the goats judgment, if you remember that from Matthew 23, I believe, prior to the millennium. Because what does it say after that? Enter into the kingdom that was prepared for you before the world, right? So they would not hold that the kingdom is now. The kingdom exists when Jesus sits on David's throne, which is not now. But yeah, I agree with what you're saying. Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. But premillennialists don't. It's a good question. Tertullian. As for the restoration of Judea, however, which even the Jews themselves included by the name of the places and countries hoped for, just as it is described, it would be tedious to state at length how the figurative interpretation is spiritually applicable to Christ and his church, and the character of the fruits thereof. Besides, the subject has been regularly treated in another work. At present, too, it would be superfluous for the reason that our inquiry relates to what is promised in heaven, not on earth. But we do confess a kingdom is promised to us upon the earth, although before heaven, only in another state of existence, inasmuch as it will be after the resurrection of 1,000 years in the divinely built city of Jerusalem, let down from heaven, Revelation 21:2, which the apostle calls our mother from above, Galatians 4:26. And while declaring that our citizenship is in heaven, he predicts of it that it is really a city in heaven. Okay, so that's more of like a classic premillennial view. The kingdom will come and there will be an earthly reign. Milo of Sardius said this: "We do consider that the Roman Empire, converted to Christianity, will one day establish the millennial kingdom." And this was he lived 160 to 180. We do consider the Roman Empire, converted to Christianity, will one day establish the millennial kingdom. So then he says this, he pictures Christ and says this: "I am he who destroyed death and triumphed over the enemies and tread down Hades and bound the strong one and bore man away to the heights of heaven." So in Revelation 20, Satan is bound for 1,000 years. And he sees this as already happening. And he believes that Rome will be converted to Christianity. And this is 200 years before Nicaea. Now we get to Origen, the bad guy, right? We get to Origen. Can someone read this? And he writes this about the Revelation, or he has a section on, or he has several sermons on Revelation 20. So this is on the two resurrections in Revelation 20. The first, which begins here, below, by baptism lived in faith, is progressive. It is realized more and more in proportion to one's spiritual and moral ascent. The second, which coincides with the end of time, the coming of Christ in glory, is perfect and total. So here clearly, he believes Revelation 20 occurs from the first advent of Christ to the second, clearly. The beheaded in Revelation 20, can someone read this? So are the beheaded in Revelation 20 current or future for him? They're present. They're priests in heaven, is how he interprets them. So this, again, would find its home far more comfortably in amillennialism, which would see a kingdom in heaven. The kingdom at the right hand of God is David's throne. But what I'm saying is that they, broadly speaking, they see the return of Christ and the resurrection of the dead as happening at the same time, and not a 1,000-year gap in between. Right? There are some that specify a 1,000-year reign, but those that don't get it from Revelation 20, they get it from Genesis 1. So what I'm saying is there's a narrative that says that everyone was premillennial and everyone interpreted literally until Origin came, and I don't think that that's supported by the sources. So if the majority would hold to a premillennial view, why don't the creeds necessitate a premillennial view? I think I've shown several quotes that show that the early church believed the return of Christ and the resurrection from the dead occur at the same time. Yeah, so I think the premillennialists believe that the kingdom of Christ is a future kingdom in which he reigns on earth on David's throne. That's what premillennialists believe. And I don't think that's clearly demonstrated by the early church fathers. That's what I'm trying to say. And if that was the broad belief of the early church fathers, they don't account for that, I don't think, according to the quotes that we've looked at. But let's look next at the Nicene Creed of 325. Let's look at this. Talk in your groups. What does it say and what does it not say about the return of Christ? Yeah, what does it say and what does it not say about the return of Christ? So it's the same question as before, yeah? Yeah, it's the same answer, yeah. It's very general. Anyone can find their home here. But it does not say that there's going to be a 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth. Again, if that's the majority view of the early church, you would think the creeds would reflect that. Instead, it looks for the coming of Christ and the resurrection from the dead at the same time. He comes, he judges, he resurrects. So he comes in glory to judge the living and the dead, and his kingdom will have no end. I look forward to the resurrection of the dead and the life in the world to come. Yeah. So I gave several quotes at the beginning of people who claimed that the early church was premillennial. And what I'm saying is these quotes and these creeds don't allow for that. Yeah, I think instead these quotes and these creeds, they're very open, but they also fit more comfortably with an amillennial or postmillennial view, because it doesn't mention a 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth or an establishment of a kingdom that has not been established yet. We'll take less time with the Nicene and post-Nicene fathers, but Athanasius on the Incarnation, which I'm having you guys read. Can someone read this for us from chapter 55? Yeah, so again, there's not a clear position on the millennium, right? As if that's the main issue. Instead, he notices that they see a pushback of idolatry, a pushback of demonic influence, things like that. I think on the Incarnation is one of the most optimistic texts written. The Incarnation is the light that shines in the darkness. Yeah, that's good. Augustine, he clearly understands Revelation 20 to occur between the two Advents. Okay, clearly. I mean, without doubt, right? No one debates this. He wrote many pages on Revelation 20. I'll just give us a couple of quotes. Now, the 1,000 years may be understood in two ways. So far as occurs to me, either because these things happen in the 6th millennium, as during the 6th day, which is to be followed by a Sabbath, which has no evening, or he used the 1,000 years as an equivalent for the whole duration of the world, employing the number of perfection to mark the fullness of time. For 1,000 is a cube of 10, and 10 times 10 makes 100. That is, the square of perfection, the square of a plane of superficies. But to give this superficies height and make it a cube, the 100 again is multiplied by 10, which gives us 1,000. Does your head hurt yet? And the same reason we cannot better interpret the words of the psalm. He is made mindful of his covenant ever for the word which he commanded to 1,000 generations, than by understanding it to mean to all generations. Right? One more quote by Augustine. Believers live in the intermediate period, separated by the incarnation of Christ from his final return in glory. The church is to be seen as an exile in the city of the world. It is in the world, yet not of the world. There is a strong eschatological tension between the present reality in which the church is exiled in the world and somehow obligated to maintain its distinctive ethos in the midst of a disbelieving world, and the future hope in which the church will be delivered from the world and finally allowed to share in the glory of God. So he's clearly amillennial, right? He has, people still read City of God to find amillennial arguments. His exegesis is still considered to be, his exegesis is what amillennials use today to understand Revelation 20. But Augustine interprets Augustine's interpretation becomes what the church in the West holds to for the next 1,000 years. Everyone follows Augustine. The Athanasian Creed is in the 5th century. This will conclude our study of the early church fathers before we get to the Reformation. But will someone read the relevant sections here, the underlined sections? So you see, the purpose of the coming of Christ here is the resurrection and the judgment. And he links the resurrection, or they link the resurrection directly to his coming and the resurrection of all people. Versus premillennialism does not hold to that. Premillennialism holds to a resurrection before the millennium and a resurrection after the millennium. Right? So premillennialism believes that the saints who died prior to the return of Christ are resurrected for the millennial kingdom. With the Jews anyway, right? And then there's a second resurrection at the end. The first resurrection, the second resurrection. This does not see a distinction between the two resurrections. There's one resurrection in which Christ comes to judge. I'm not saying it denies premillennialism, but I am saying once again, these quotes find their home more easily within amillennialism or postmillennialism than premillennialism, I think. So here's what I'm not saying. Here's what I don't want to do. I don't want to do the opposite of the anachronism and say all these guys are amil except for these 2 or 3 guys. That's not what I'm trying to say. What I am trying to say is the early church was not clearly premillennial. The early church had an underdeveloped eschatology. And when the church did come to write creeds and confessions, when it did mention eschatology, it was broad enough to include a variety of perspectives. Does that make sense? So a view of the return of Christ that sees all the events happening at his second coming would be more comfortable in these creeds. I'm not saying they deny a premillennial view, but I am saying premillennialism has to say yes and also, whereas these don't necessitate the yes and also. And when it comes to the resurrection, especially here, the resurrection at his coming, a single resurrection, not because Revelation 20 says there's a first resurrection and a second resurrection, right? There's a first resurrection and a second resurrection. This does not see 2 physical resurrections. It sees one single resurrection at the end of time when Christ returns. I'm not saying it denies premillennialism, but I am saying that if you see the first one as a spiritual resurrection and the second one as a physical resurrection, you'll be more happy with this, I think. All right. What I don't want to do is do the same. I don't want to be anachronistic to combat anachronism. But I am saying that I think when amillennialists read these texts and these creeds, they have to do less addition than premillennialists do. Premillennialists have to say, yes, that, and let me add in a few more details. I don't think the early church was all-millennial. I don't think the early church was post-millennial. I don't think the early church was premillennial. I think the early church had a very simple eschatology in which they saw Christ returning, and when Christ returned, the dead were raised and judged. And there are some people who had a more developed eschatology in which they understood there to be 1,000 years in between, but those who did tended to find that in Genesis 1 and not exegesis of Revelation 20, right? Which is where premillennialists today, rightly so, derive their doctrine of an earthly reign of Christ from Revelation 20, not from Genesis 1. But I think if you sat down a premillennialist with an early church father who believed in a 1,000-year reign of Christ, and they started talking, they would at first be like, oh, we agree on so much, and all of a sudden, things would just splinter. We'd start talking about Genesis 1 and all this stuff. Yeah. Oh, the 1,000 years? Most of them don't mention it. Yeah, most of them don't mention it. And if they don't mention it, it must not be significant in their eschatology. I would rather say that than say they don't mention it, however it was significant in their eschatology, right? Both people are arguing from silence, but I feel like I have to interact with that argument from silence, with my own argument from silence, because the proposition has been made. Most of them don't mention it, from my understanding, my survey. Yeah, good question. And a lot of them see the kingdom as a heavenly kingdom and not an earthly kingdom.